Fatima was a 72-year-old widow who had given everything to raise her son, Ahmed. But when his wife Aisha demanded she sign over her house, her own son stayed silent. Betrayed and broken, Fatima sought help, fought back legally, reclaimed her home, and ultimately rebuilt her life with quiet strength and dignity. Now let's hear his sad story from him only.
My name is Fatima, and at 72 years old, I thought I had seen every kind of heartbreak life could offer. I was wrong. That Tuesday morning in March, when my daughter-in-law Aisha walked into my living room with a folder thick with documents, I felt something shift in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. "Ami," she said, her voice carrying none of the warmth it once held, "we need to talk." My son Ahmed sat beside her on the sofa I had saved months to buy, his eyes fixed on the carpet pattern I'd memorized over 20 years of calling this place home. The clock on the mantel, a wedding gift from my late husband, ticked, louder than usual, each second echoing in the suffocating silence that had settled over what was once a house filled with laughter. Aisha spread the papers across my coffee table with the precision of a lawyer presenting evidence. "These are property transfer documents," she announced, sliding a pen toward me like a weapon. "You need to sign them." I stared at the black ink, the official seals, the legal jargon that might as well have been written in a foreign language. But I understood enough. My house, the house I had built brick by brick with my widow's pension, the house where I had raised my son alone, where every corner held memories of scraped knees and birthday celebrations. They wanted me to sign it away. Why? The word escaped my lips as barely a whisper. Ahmed finally looked up, and in his eyes, I saw the little boy who used to run to me when thunderstorms frightened him. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who couldn't meet his mother's gaze for more than a heartbeat. "It's for the best, Ma," he mumbled, his voice hollow. "For the family's future." The family's future, not our future, not my future. Theirs. I felt something crack inside my chest, not my heart breaking, but something deeper. The foundation of everything I had believed about love, about sacrifice, about the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. Aisha tapped the pen against the table impatiently. "The sooner you sign, the smoother this transition will be for everyone." Transition, as if I were a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight like a stone in my palm. The room spun slightly, and I gripped the arm of my chair, the chair where I had rocked Ahmad to sleep countless nights, where I had sat during his fever spells, where I had waited up when he came home late from college. Something in my heart had long sensed this day was coming. The subtle changes, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the way Aisha's eyes had grown cold over the past months. But sensing and experiencing are two different kinds of pain. As I held that pen, staring at the line marked with a yellow highlighter where my signature would seal my fate, I remembered my husband's words from 30 years ago. "Fatima, never sign anything you don't understand completely." But when I finally read what she made me sign, I realized this wasn't just betrayal, it was war. Let me take you back to understand how we arrived at this moment of devastation. 32 years ago, when Ahmed was just 6 years old, my husband Khalil collapsed at the construction site where he worked. A heart attack at 38 Sudan, merciless, final. In one morning, I went from being a housewife to a widow with a child, to raise and no income to speak of. The relatives who had gathered around our dinner table every Friday suddenly became scarce. The promises of support faded like morning mist. It was just Ahmed and me, in a tiny rented apartment that smelled perpetually of the neighboring family's cooking. I remember sitting on the floor of that cramped kitchen, surrounded by bills I couldn't read properly. My education had ended at the 8th grade when my father decided girls needed to learn housework, not books. Ahmed slept on a mattress in the corner, his small body curled around a worn teddy bear his father had bought him just weeks before the accident. That night, I made a vow that would shape the next 25 years of my life. My son would have everything I never had: education, opportunities, choices. I would make sure of it, no matter what it cost me. I took a job at a textile factory, working 12-hour shifts on machines that left my fingers raw and my back aching. When that wasn't enough, I cleaned offices, in the evenings, mopping floors while Ahmed did his homework by the dim light of a single bulb. My wedding bangles, gold, that had been passed down through 3 generations, went to the pawn shop to pay for his school fees. My mother's earrings followed when he needed books for his intermediate exams. I never remarried, though well-meaning neighbors often suggested suitable widowers. How could I? Every rupee, every moment, every breath, was dedicated to building Ahmed's future. Marriage would have meant divided attention, and my son deserved everything I had to give. Slowly, painfully, we climbed out of that suffocating poverty. Ahmed excelled in school, then college, then landed a good job at an engineering firm. With his first salary, he insisted we move out of that cramped apartment. Together, we found this house, modest but ours, with a small garden where I could grow the jasmine flowers Khalil had loved. I worked for 10 more years to pay off the mortgage, even after Ahmed was earning well. This house became my pride, my proof that a woman alone could build something lasting. Every tile I chose, every coat of paint I applied with my own hands, every repair I managed this house was the monument to our journey from desperation to dignity. When Ahmed told me he wanted to marry Aisha, I was overjoyed. She was educated, well-spoken, from a respectable family. During the engagement, she would visit me in the afternoons, helping me cook and asking for recipes. She called me Ami, with what seemed like genuine affection, and I believed I was gaining the daughter I had never had. Ami, you raised such a wonderful son, she would say, squeezing my hand. I promise I'll take good care of him and of you. I welcomed her into our home like a queen returning to her palace. I gave them the master bedroom, the one with the morning sunlight and the view of my garden. I moved my belongings to the smaller room without complaint, telling myself that sacrifice was simply love in action. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air in the house began to change. Aisha's friends started visiting more frequently, and their conversations would pause when I entered the room. She began rearranging furniture without asking, replacing my simple curtains with expensive ones that made the rooms feel like a stranger's house. Ahmad, caught between his wife and his mother, began retreating into silence whenever tensions arose. The final straw came 6 months ago, when I overheard her talking to her sister on the phone. Living with a mother-in-law is so suffocating. She acts like this house belongs to her just because her name is on some old papers. Some old papers, the deed to the house I had bled for, the mortgage I had paid with my factory wages, the home I had built from nothing reduced to some old papers. Still, I told myself, families heal. Until one night, I overheard what they really thought of me. Ahmed's 34th birthday fell on a crisp October evening, and I had been planning the celebration for weeks. Despite the growing tension in the house, I convinced myself that family gatherings could bridge any gap, heal any wound. I spent the entire day in the kitchen, preparing his favorite dishes. The aroma of slow-cooked biryani filled every corner of the house, mixing with the sweetness of the kheer I had started at dawn. My hands, now weathered and spotted with age, still remembered the exact measurements my mother-in-law had taught me decades ago. A pinch of saffron, just enough cardamom to perfume but not overpower. By evening, the house buzzed with guests. Aisha's friends arrived first, their designer clothes and perfectly applied makeup making my simple shalwar kameez look faded by comparison. Ahmed's colleagues followed, filling the living room with laughter and conversation that should have warmed my heart, but somehow made me feel invisible. I moved through my own home like a ghost serving the living. Aisha, this biryani is incredible, one of her friends exclaimed. Where did you learn to cook like this? Without missing a beat, Aisha smiled and accepted the compliment. Oh, it's just practice. I've been experimenting with traditional recipes. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, holding an empty serving dish, watching my daughter-in-law take credit for the meal I had spent 10 hours preparing. Ahmed was across the room, cutting his birthday cake, surrounded by well-wishers who praised the beautiful decorations, the flowers I had arranged, the lights I had strung up while he was at work. He caught my eye for a moment and smiled, the kind of smile that once would have made all my efforts worthwhile, but now it felt hollow, stretched thin across a face that carried guilt he couldn't quite acknowledge. As the evening wore on, I found myself retreating to the kitchen more often, cleaning dishes that didn't need cleaning, avoiding the living room where I felt like an intruder at my own son's party. Through the doorway, I watched Aisha hold court, discussing property investments with Ahmed's friends, her voice carrying a confidence that made everyone lean in to listen. Real estate is so tricky these days, she was saying. You have to be smart about ownership documents. Make sure everything is properly transferred to avoid legal complications later. The conversation made my stomach twist with unease, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Later, as I was refilling the water pitcher, I noticed Aisha slip away from the group and walk toward the old wooden cabinet where I kept important documents, birth certificates, my husband's death certificate, the house deed. She opened it casually, as if looking for something specific. Are you looking for something? I asked, approaching with the water pitcher still in my hands. She startled slightly, then smiled that practiced smile. Oh, just looking for some paper napkins. I thought I saw some in here earlier, but the napkins were clearly visible on the dining table, and her hands had been rifling through the manila folders, not searching the small drawers below. I watched as she closed the cabinet and walked away, but something cold settled in my stomach. Throughout the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being studied, evaluated, measured for something I didn't understand. The guests left with full bellies and warm thanks directed entirely at Aisha Ahmed, hugged me goodnight, but his embrace felt like an apology for something that hadn't happened yet. I stayed up late that night, cleaning the kitchen until every surface gleamed, trying to wash away the feeling that I had just hosted my own farewell party. The next morning, she came to Manath with a smile, but with those papers. Ahmed's 34th birthday fell on a crisp October evening, and I had been planning the celebration for weeks. Despite the growing tension in the house, I convinced myself that family gatherings could bridge any gap, heal any wound. I spent the entire day in the kitchen, preparing his favorite dishes. The aroma of slow-cooked biryani filled every corner of the house, mixing with the sweetness of the kheer I had started at dawn. My hands, now weathered and spotted with age, still remembered the exact measurements my mother-in-law had taught me decades ago: a pinch of saffron, just enough cardamom to perfume but not overpower. By evening, the house buzzed with guests. Aisha's friends arrived first, their designer clothes and perfectly applied makeup making my simple shalwar kameez look faded by comparison. Ahmed's colleagues followed, filling the living room with laughter and conversation that should have warmed my heart but somehow made me feel invisible. I moved through my own home like a ghost, serving the living. Aisha, this biryani is incredible, one of her friends exclaimed. Where did you learn to cook like this? Without missing a beat, Aisha smiled and accepted the compliment. Oh, it's just practice. I've been experimenting with traditional recipes. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, holding an empty serving dish, watching my daughter-in-law take credit for the meal I had spent 10 hours preparing. Ahmad was across the room, cutting his birthday cake, surrounded by well-wishers who praised the beautiful decorations, the flowers I had arranged, the lights I had strung up while he was at work. He caught my eye for a moment and smiled, the kind of smile that once would have made all my efforts worthwhile, but now it felt hollow, stretched thin across a face that carried guilt he couldn't quite acknowledge. As the evening wore on, I found myself retreating to the kitchen more often, cleaning dishes that didn't need cleaning, avoiding the living room where I felt like an intruder at my own son's party. Through the doorway, I watched Aisha hold court, discussing property investments with Ahmed's friends, her voice carrying a confidence that made everyone lean in to listen. Real estate is so tricky these days, she was saying. You have to be smart about ownership documents, make sure everything is properly transferred to avoid legal complications later. The conversation made my stomach twist with unease, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Later, as I was refilling the water pitcher, I noticed Aisha slip away from the group and walk toward the old wooden cabinet where I kept important documents, certificates, my husband's death certificate, the house deed. She opened it casually, as if looking for something specific. Are you looking for something? I asked, approaching with the water pitcher still in my hands. She startled slightly, then smiled that practiced smile. Oh, just looking for some paper napkins. I thought I saw some in here earlier. But the napkins were clearly visible on the dining table, and her hands had been rifling through the manila folders, not searching the small drawers below. I watched as she closed the cabinet and walked away, but something cold settled in my stomach. Throughout the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being studied, evaluated, measured for something I didn't understand. The guests left with full bellies and warm thanks directed entirely at Aisha Ahmed, hugged me goodnight. But his embrace felt like an apology for something that hadn't happened yet. I stayed up late that night, cleaning the kitchen until every surface gleamed, trying to wash away the feeling that I had just hosted my own farewell party. The next morning, she came to me not with a smile, but with those papers. Ruksa. Small apartment smelled of chamomile tea and old books, a sanctuary that felt like stepping back in time to when friendship meant something unshakable. She had been my colleague at the textile factory, and though she had gone on to complete her education and become a school principal, she never forgot where she came from. Who had stood by her during those difficult early years. When I appeared at her doorstep with my single suitcase and tear-stained face, she didn't ask questions. She simply opened her arms and let me fall apart in the safety of her embrace. For 3 days, I couldn't speak about what had happened. I moved through her small rooms like a sleepwalker, drinking the tea she pressed into my hands, eating the simple meals she prepared, staring out her window at a neighborhood I didn't recognize. I felt hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside me and scooped away everything that made me who I was. On the 4th morning, Ruxana sat beside me on her old sofa and placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Fatima," she said in the voice that had commanded respect from thousands of students over her career, "it's time to tell me what happened." The story poured out of me like water from a broken dam. The papers, the threats, Ahmed's silence, the systematic way they had erased me from my own life. Ruxana listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "You know what your problem was, Beta," she finally said, using the endearment that reminded me we were not just friends but sisters forged in struggle. I shook my head, too drained to guess. "You gave your son everything but forgot to keep something for yourself." Power. The word hit me like a physical blow. Power. In all my years of sacrifice, it had never occurred to me that I was giving away more than my money, my time, my comfort. I was giving away my ability to protect myself. "I don't understand," I whispered. Ruxana stood up and walked to her bookshelf, pulling out a thin folder. "When my husband died, my mother-in-law tried the same thing, wanted me to sign over my house, move in with my brother, become everyone's burden instead of my own woman." She sat back down and opened the folder, revealing property documents, legal papers, bank statements. "But I learned something that you forgot, Fatima. Love without boundaries becomes doormat. Kindness without limits becomes weakness." I stared at the papers in her hands, seeing not just documents but evidence of choices I had never known I could make. "What did you do?" I asked. "I hired a lawyer, learned my rights, discovered that emotional manipulation has no legal standing, but property ownership does." She leaned forward, her eyes intense with the fire that had made her a formidable educator. "Fatima, you worked for 30 years to buy that house. Your name is on the deed, unless you signed it away." "I didn't sign," I said quickly. "I left before they could force me." Something shifted in Ruxana's expression, like a general realizing the battle wasn't lost after all. "Then you still own your home, and they're living in it illegally." For the first time in days, I felt something other than despair. Not hope, exactly, but something harder and more used. Hunger, not the hot, destructive anger that burns everything in its path, but the cold, calculated anger that builds strategies and wins wars. I began to remember things I had forgotten in my emotional devastation. The original house purchase documents were in my name. The mortgage had been paid from my bank account. When Ahmed's name was added to the utility bills, it was as an authorized user, not an owner. But they said there were tax issues, legal complications. They lied, Ruxana said simply. "Scare tactics to make you think you had no choice." I spent that evening going through every document I could remember, every legal paper I had ever signed. Ruxana made phone calls to her network of retired colleagues, teachers, principals, women who had navigated the legal system's complexities while raising children and fighting for their rights. By the end of the week, I had the name of a lawyer who specialized in property disputes and elder abuse. More importantly, I had something I hadn't possessed in months: a plan. When I checked the property files again, I found one small clause Aisha had overlooked. The law office of Barrister Malik was nothing like I had imagined. Instead of the intimidating wood-paneled chambers I had seen in movies, it was a modest space above a pharmacy, with fluorescent lighting and metal filing cabinets that had seen better decades. But Barrister Malik himself inspired confidence in a way that had nothing to do with his He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested he had heard every story and wasn't easily shocked. "Mrs. Fatima," he said after reviewing the documents Ruxana and I had gathered, "this is quite straightforward from a legal perspective. The property is registered in your name under your deceased husband's transfer. Your daughter-in-law has no legal claim whatsoever." I felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "But they said there were complications." "The only complication is that they're trying to defraud you," he said bluntly. "What they attempted to do, pressuring you to sign over property through threats and emotional manipulation. It's called elder abuse. It's illegal." He pulled out a legal pad and began writing notes as he spoke. We'll file an injunction preventing them from selling or mortgaging the property. Then we'll serve them with a notice to vacate unless they can prove legal right to occupy the premises. Will Ahmed get in trouble? The question escaped before I could stop it, revealing the part of me that still wanted to protect the son who had abandoned me. Barrister Malik paused in his writing and looked at me with something like pity. Mrs. Fatima, your son made his choice when he chose to remain silent while his wife threatened you. But if you're concerned about his welfare, there's another approach. He explained that we could start with a formal legal notice rather than immediate court action, a warning shot that would give them a chance to rectify the situation before facing criminal charges. Sometimes, he said, people do terrible things because they think there will be no consequences. When consequences appear, they often remember their humanity. I agreed to the gentler approach, though not out of mercy. I wanted them to understand that their actions had awakened something in me. They hadn't expected not just an old woman's desperation, but a mother's calculated fury. For 2 weeks, I said nothing to anyone except Ruxana about the legal proceedings. I stayed in her spare room, helped with her household tasks, and waited with the patience I had learned during 30 years of factory work. Ahmed called on the third day. Ma, where are you? Are you okay? His voice carried genuine worry, mixed with guilt. I'm safe, I replied calmly. Living with a friend. Aisha is concerned about you. She thinks maybe we moved too fast with the house discussion. Maybe we can work something out, Ahmed. I interrupted. Do you remember what your father used to say about trust? A pause. That trust is like a thread. Once it's broken, you can tie it back together. But the knot will always show. Yes, the knot will always show. I hung up without saying goodbye. The calls continued. 3 more from Ahmed, 2 from neighbors who had been asked to check on me, 1 from a cousin who suddenly remembered my existence. Each time, I remained pleasant but distant, giving no indication of my plans. Aisha, confident in her victory, began redecorating the house. I learned this from Mrs. Rahman next door, who called to tell me about the furniture being delivered. The painters who had worked for 3 days straight. She's really making herself at home, Mrs. Rahman said with disapproval, acting like she built that house herself. I thanked her for the information and added it to the growing file of evidence that would support our case. 2 weeks after our first meeting, Barrister Malik called with news. The notice is ready to be served. Are you prepared for what comes next? I looked around Ruxana's small apartment, at the simple life she had built through her own strength and determination. Then I thought of my house, my garden, my kitchen, my memories, embedded in every corner, being inhabited by people who had tried to erase me from my own story. I'm ready, I said. So, when the letter arrived at their doorstep, she finally knew. I wasn't gone. I was watching. The legal notice was served on a Thursday morning while Ahmed was at work and Aisha was alone in the house, my house. Mrs. Rahman called me within an hour, her voice bubbling with barely contained excitement. Fatima Beta, you should have seen her face when that man in the uniform handed her that envelope. She went white as a sheet. I could picture it perfectly. Aisha, in her silk dressing gown, her morning tea growing cold as she read the formal language that stripped away all her pretenses and laid bare the truth of her situation. The notice gave them 7 days to respond to the allegations of attempted fraud and elder abuse, and 14 days to vacate the premises unless they could provide legal documentation proving their right to occupy the property. That evening, my phone rang incessantly. First Ahmed, his voice panicked and confused. Ma, what is this legal notice? Aisha is crying, saying you're trying to destroy our family. What's happening? Then, Aisha herself, her tone, a mixture of fury and desperation. Ami, how could you do this to us? We're family. We can work this out without involving lawyers and courts. I listened to each call with the calm detachment I had learned from watching Ruxana handle difficult parents during her years as a principal. When people are exposed, they reveal their true nature, some with dignity, others with desperate aggression. Aisha, I said during her third call, when you threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent, did you think about family then? The line went quiet for a long moment. I was emotional. I didn't mean, you meant every word. And now you'll face the consequences of those words. Within days, the neighborhood began to buzz with whispers. The same relatives who had disappeared after my husband's death suddenly emerged from the shadows, calling to offer advice and mediation. My phone rang with concerned voices, each one beginning with variations of "we had no idea what was happening." followed by suggestions that we handle this privately, within the family. I declined every offer of intervention. Barrister Malik kept me informed of their legal team's attempts at response. First, they claimed the transfer documents were legitimate and that I had agreed to them. When he demanded to see these documents, they couldn't produce anything with my signature. Then they argued that I had abandoned the property voluntarily. When he pointed out that abandonment required formal legal documentation, they fell silent. They're grasping at straws. He told me during our meeting a week before the court hearing. Their lawyer knows they have no case, but they're hoping you'll settle out of court to avoid public embarrassment. Will there be embarrassment? I asked. For them, certainly. Property fraud cases are public record. The newspapers often pick up stories about elder abuse, especially when they involve educated, middle-class families. I thought about Ahmed, reading about his actions in the morning newspaper, about Aisha's friends learning the truth behind her comfortable lifestyle. The prospect should have given me satisfaction, but instead, I felt only a deep sadness for the destruction of what had once been love. The court hearing took place on a gray Monday morning in November. I dressed carefully, not in my usual simple clothes, but in the formal shalwar kameez I had worn to Ahmed's wedding, paired with my late husband's watch and the one piece of jewelry I had never pawned, my wedding ring. I wanted to look like what I was, a woman of dignity who had been wronged, not a victim begging for mercy. Aisha sat in the front row with their lawyer, her face carefully composed but her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her purse. Ahmed sat beside her, staring at his shoes with the same expression he had worn as a child when caught in a lie. When Barrister Malik presented our evidence, the original property documents, the mortgage payment records, the timeline of events leading to my judge listened with the weary attention of someone who had seen too many families destroy themselves over money and pride. Aisha's lawyer made a weak attempt to argue that the transfer request had been made in good faith, that misunderstandings had occurred on both sides, but when the judge asked for documentation supporting their claim to the property, they had nothing to offer. Mrs. Fatima, the judge said, turning to me directly, this is your property, legally and clearly. The court finds no evidence of any legitimate claim by the property remains fully yours, and any attempt to transfer it without your informed consent would constitute fraud. I watched Aisha's face crumble as the words sank in. Her careful composure dissolved into tears that might have been genuine remorse or simple frustration at being caught. As we filed out of the courtroom, Ahmed approached me hesitantly. Ma, can we talk? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the monster I had built him up to be in my anger, but a weak man who had made terrible choices and was finally understanding their costs. But what my son did next, that broke me all over again. Ahmed followed me to the courthouse steps, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the marble in a rhythm that reminded me of his childhood tap dancing lessons, the ones I had paid for with overtime shifts at the factory. Ma, please. 5 minutes. I paused, partly from exhaustion and partly from a curiosity I couldn't suppress. What could he possibly say now that judgment had been rendered, that the truth had been laid bare in a public courtroom? We sat on a bench outside the courthouse, pigeons pecking at crumbs near our feet, the November wind cutting through my shawl. Ahmed sat with his head in his hands for a long moment before speaking. I knew, he said quietly, about the plan, about the papers, about everything. The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I had suspected it. Hearing him confirm his complicity made it real in a way that hurt more than Aisha's calculated cruelty. Why? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Because I'm weak, he said simply. Because Aisha made it sound so reasonable, so necessary. She said you were getting older, that managing property was becoming too much for you, that this way we could take care of everything and you could just relax. Relax in some senior housing complex while you lived in the house I built. He flinched. She made it sound like a kindness, and you believed her because it was easier than standing up to your wife. Ahmed looked at me then, and I saw tears on his cheeks. Ma, I've been trying to make everyone happy for so long that I forgot what was right. Aisha wanted the house. You wanted respect. And I thought maybe if I just went along with it, somehow it would all work out. The familiar ache of maternal love warred with the fresh wound of betrayal in my chest. This was still my son, the boy I had raised alone, the man I had sacrificed everything to educate and elevate. But he was also the man who had chosen his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity. Ahmed, I said carefully, What you and Aisha did to me, that wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was planned, calculated theft disguised as family concern. I know that now, he whispered. I know, and I hate myself for it. Hating yourself is not the same as making amends. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and for a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to cry over scraped knees. What can I do, Ma? How can I fix this? The question hung in the cold air between us. Part of me wanted to wrap my arms around him, to tell him all was forgiven, to pretend that love could erase the damage that had been done. But Ruxana's words echoed in my mind. Love without boundaries becomes a doormat. You can start by telling Aisha that your mother will not be visiting your home, accepting your invitations, or pretending that what happened can be undone by politeness. He looked stricken. But you're still my mother. I still love you. Love is not a feeling, Ahmed. It's a choice you make every day through your actions. You chose Aisha's comfort over my safety. That choice has consequences. So you're cutting me out of your life, forever. I studied his face, seeing not just my son but also the man who had stood silently while his wife threatened me with legal incompetency proceedings. I'm not cutting you out, I said slowly. I'm setting boundaries. If you want a relationship with me, it will be one where I am treated with respect and dignity. Not because I'm your mother, but because I'm a human being who deserves both. Ahmad nodded, though I could see he didn't fully understand the distinction yet. And Aisha made her feelings about me very clear. I have no interest in pretending otherwise for the sake of family harmony. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching people walk past, lawyers and judges, defendants and families, all carrying their own stories of justice sought and consequences faced. Finally, Ahmed stood up. I need to go. She's not handling this well. Neither did I replied, but I handled it. As he walked away, I felt something break inside me again, not my heart this time, but the last threads of the relationship I had cherished above all others, the unconditional love between mother and son, tested by betrayal and found wanting. And yet, when I thought it was all over, destiny had one more surprise waiting. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of my new home, a modest 2-bedroom apartment with large windows that filled the space with morning light. It wasn't the house I had built brick by brick, but it was mine in a way that felt cleaner, unburdened by memories of betrayal. After the court ruling, I had made the decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I sold the house. Not to Ahmed and Aisha. They had moved out quietly within a week of the judgment, relocating to a smaller place across town. Instead, I sold it to a young couple with twin toddlers who reminded me of Ahmed at that age, all boundless energy and innocent demands. With the proceeds, I bought this apartment and invested the remainder in a fixed deposit that would ensure my independence for the rest of my life. No one could threaten me with homelessness again. No one could make me feel like a burden in my own space. The apartment smelled of the jasmine plants I had rescued from my old garden, now thriving on the balcony in terracotta pots. The walls were painted in soft yellows and greens colors I had chosen without consulting anyone, without considering anyone's preferences but my own. I had filled the second bedroom with books and a small desk where I tutored neighborhood children in Urdu and basic mathematics. Word had spread quietly through the local mothers network. The widow in apartment 3B had taught her son so well that he became an engineer, and she would help their children with homework for a modest fee. These sessions brought me more joy than I had expected, watching 8-year-old Zara master long division, helping 10-year-old Hassan improve his handwriting, seeing their faces light up when difficult concepts suddenly made sense. It reminded me why I had worked so hard for Ahmed's education, not for gratitude or recognition, but for the pure satisfaction of watching potential transform into achievement. My days had developed a rhythm that felt like healing. Morning tea on the balcony while reading the newspaper, afternoon tutoring sessions filled with patient explanations and small victories, evening walks through the neighborhood, nodding to shopkeepers who knew me now as Mrs. Fatima from the apartments, not as someone's mother-in-law or victim of family drama. Ruxana visited twice a week, and we had developed the kind of friendship I had never experienced before, one based on mutual respect rather than shared hardship. We discussed books, politics, the absurdities of aging in a world designed for the young. She had become the sister I had never had, proof that family could be chosen as well as inherited. One Thursday evening in spring, as I was watering my jasmine plants, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Ahmed standing in the hallway, holding a small, wrapped package. He looked older, thinner, as if the weight of his choices had carved new lines around his eyes. "Ma," he said quietly, "I know you said you needed space, but it's been 6 months, and I wanted to give you this." He held out the package, small, rectangular, wrapped in simple brown paper. I hesitated, then stepped aside to let him enter. He stood awkwardly in my living room, taking in the bright colors, the orderly bookshelves, the photos I had hung, pictures of my parents, my late husband, even a few of Ahmed as a child, but none from his wedding day. "You look good, Ma." "Happy." "I am," I said, and realized it was true. He unwrapped the package and pulled out a simple wooden frame containing a photograph I hadn't seen in months, the three of us from Ahmed's graduation day, before Aisha, before the betrayal, when we still believed love was enough to sustain any relationship. "I thought you might want this," he said, placing it carefully on my coffee table. I stared at the photograph, remembering that day, my pride in his achievement, his arms around me as we posed for the camera, the future that had seemed so bright and uncomplicated. "Why?" I asked. "Because whatever else happened, this was real. We were happy once." I picked up the frame, running my finger along the glass. "Yes, we were. Aisha and I are separating," he said quietly. "The stress of everything, the shame of what we did, it broke something between us." I felt no satisfaction at this news, only a deep sadness for the destruction that could have been avoided if anyone had chosen differently at any point along the way. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Are you?" he asked, searching my face. "I'm sorry that you're in pain. I'm sorry that your marriage couldn't survive the consequences of your choices, but I'm not sorry that there were consequences." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer but hoped for something different. We talked for another hour, politely, like distant relatives catching up after years apart. He told me about his work, his plans to move to a smaller apartment, his growing understanding of what he had lost. I told him about my tutoring, my independence, the peace I had found in designing a life that belonged entirely to me. When he left, he paused at the door. "Ma, do you think someday we might be able to be a family again?" I considered the question seriously. "Ahmed, we will always be connected by blood and history, but family requires trust, respect, and mutual care. If you can learn to offer those things consistently, then perhaps we can build something new. Not what we had before. What we had before was built on my sacrifice and your dependence. That wasn't healthy for either of us." After he left, I sat on my balcony with the photograph in my lap, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that was becoming home. The image captured a moment of genuine happiness, but it also represented a relationship that had been unbalanced from the beginning. My love conditional on nothing, his love conditional on convenience. I learned that love built on silence isn't love at all, it's surrender, and I will never surrender again. As I write these words, sitting in my garden of jasmine and morning glories, I want to speak directly to you too, every mother reading this, every wife who has given until she disappeared, every woman who has confused self-sacrifice with love. I spent 30 years believing that the measure of my worth was how much I could give away. I thought love meant erasing myself so others could shine brighter. I confused enabling with nurturing, silence with harmony, and my own exhaustion with virtue. The truth I learned too late is this: love without self-respect becomes a cage. When we teach people that we have no boundaries, we shouldn't be surprised when they test that lesson to its breaking point. My son grew up watching me sacrifice everything, my comfort, my needs, my identity for his benefit, without meaning to. I taught him that my worth was measured by my usefulness to him. When his wife wanted to dispose of me, he already understood that I existed to serve their needs, not to claim dignity for myself. This is the bitter harvest of unconditional giving. We raised people who cannot imagine us as complete human beings deserving of consideration. But here is what I want you to understand. Dear sister, if you recognize yourself in my story, it is never too late to reclaim your power. Not the power to control others, but the power to control your own life, to set boundaries, to demand respect, not as a favor but as a right. The house I fought for and won, I sold it, not because I was defeated, but because I realized that holding on to what had been contaminated by betrayal would never bring me peace. Sometimes, victory looks like walking away with your dignity intact rather than clinging to what others have poisoned. Today, I am happier than I have been in decades, not because my life is perfect, but because it is authentically mine. Every choice, every boundary, Every relationship is built on mutual respect, rather than one-sided sacrifice. Not my son visits occasionally now. Our conversations are polite, careful, colored by both love and loss. He is learning, slowly, to see me as a person rather than just a source of endless giving. Whether we can build something healthy from the ruins of what we had remains to be seen. But I no longer need his love to feel complete. The children I tutor call me Nana Fatima, and their innocent affection feeds my soul in ways that demanded gratitude never could. Their mothers invite me for tea, seeking advice about their own struggles with in-laws' husbands and the delicate balance between nurturing and self-preservation. Tell them what I wish someone had told me 30 years ago. Love is not a competition to see who can disappear most completely. Real love, the kind worth having, requires two whole people choosing each other freely, not one person consuming another until only bones remain. Justice doesn't always roar in courts or arguments. Sometimes it whispers in the quiet strength of a woman who rises again, who refuses to accept crumbs from the table she set with her own hands, who understands finally that her worth was never up for negotiation. If my story sounds familiar, if you see your own reflection in my pain, then let it also show you your own possibility. You are not too old, too tired, too invested to change direction. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions or protecting them from the consequences of their choices. Your love is precious not because it asks for nothing in return, but because it comes from a person worthy of love herself. Never forget that truth, especially when the people around you try to convince you otherwise. The jasmine blooms every morning now, filling my small balcony with sweetness that belongs to no one but me, and in that daily miracle of renewal, I remember, we are never too far gone to start again.